So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Lucy Brown. I'm the Deputy Director of the Florence Nightingale Foundation Academy. Part of my role is to host the webinar series, and we're really delighted to welcome Major Adam Hughes this afternoon, who's going to be sharing more about how to be a good operator. Before I start, just to let you know, we will be filming as we do all of ours, so the video will be available in a couple of days. You can share it with colleagues or refer back if there's anything interesting in there. We do want this to be a really interactive session this afternoon, so we've got a few questions through, and Adam's really happy to take questions as we go through, so it's really interactive. So we really want to stimulate discussion, so please don't be shy. If you do feel a little shy, please do pop your questions in the chat box and I can ask it on your behalf, or either raise your virtual hand or your actual hand and we'll get to you in turn. Good stuff. So just a bit of background on Adam. Adam has worked within the NHS for 10 years and moved across to work within the Queen Alexandra Royal Army Nursing Corps at Quarunk in 2009. And he's specialised in acute medical practitioner. So he's been out in Afghanistan, Sierra Leone, Jordan, amongst many places. And I've got lots of interesting stories, I'm sure, that he can share with us. He started a doctorate looking into what it means to be a good operator, looking at that non-technical competence, which he's going to share with us today. So without further ado, I'm going to welcome Adam and hand across to you for a presentation. Thanks so much for joining us. We're really excited.
Fantastic. Right, let's see if we can bring the slides up. So just to reiterate Lucy's point there, this is an interactive session. I'm hoping to stimulate a bit of conversation and understand what we think of competence and non-technical competence. Please do use the chat box if you don't want to talk directly onto the screen, but it's a really good opportunity for us to share ideas. Like I say, we're going to focus more on the non-technical competence a little bit later on, but we're going to open some discussion. There's a little bit towards the end on how competence can be measured. If our discussions go over, then we'll capture that when this is sent out later on. Next slide, please. So a little bit of background. I'm currently studying for a professional doctorate in health sciences, and one of the key things that's close to my heart is how we look at competence and how we assess our people as being competent. And the idea of this good operator has sort of slightly emerged over the course of time. And the thing about the good operator is what does a good operator look like? We all know what someone a brilliant someone looks like. We work with them all the time. We see them and go, wow, that guy, that girl, absolutely amazing, superb. But how do we define that? How do we really put a finger on what that actually means? Likewise, I think, and unfortunately it's probably a little bit easier, we know what someone who's not quite so good looks like. So we see people who perhaps struggle in the clinical setting or perhaps struggle in other settings. So we kind of understand what good and what bad looks like, but we haven't really defined it. We haven't really got to grips with what that means, what the implications of that are. So we talk quite frequently in nursing about competence, and it's quite well discussed across the literature. In fact, really late 90s into the early noughties, there was a glut about how we look at competence and how we kind of move things forward from that front. Part of that is regulatory, part of that was because the public expected us to be answerable to a certain degree for the decisions that we make, but also there's the moral element, and I'll go on to that in just a second. So what we're looking at in this session is the wide and varying definitions, how the challenges exist with that interchangeable terminology, and the focus that is currently placed on the training environment. One piece of research, I think it was Bluzin, had written that a lot of the competence research kind of stops after 5 years post-registration, and there's loads and loads prior to that, and there's some with the advanced practice, but there's that middle ground which actually hasn't got that much covering it off. So it's difficult for us to understand, and difficult for us to, as a consequence of that, to meet competence in its entirety. So next slide, please. So why be competent? there are days where it's like, why am I doing this? Particularly if I'm at a mandated training session, I'm sat at the back and I'm trying to keep my eyelids open. I think we've all been in that situation. But why do we do it? Well, the first one is that we are legally required to do it. We have to do it under the Health and Social Care Act, particularly in the UK. We are required to, or employers are required to ensure that workers have the qualifications and skills necessary to carry out their roles. It does create something of a problem for the employers if they are not providing the relevant training. Likewise, we have the regulatory body requirements, the NMC Code of Conduct, or the code as it is called now in the NMC, trying to be quite cool and funky. It's driven by safety and professional standards, and that's supported by CQC as well, who regulate that process. Perhaps, and this is a discussion point perhaps for later on, it's the right thing to do. People entrust their lives, their health, their safety to us on a daily basis. And even in some of the smallest acts that we carry out, it's still morally the right thing for us to do. We have to deliver the best possible care within our capabilities. And that means ensuring that we're up to date and that we are competent to deliver. But again, that brings us to that nice question: what is it to be competent? So that leads me nicely onto the next slide with the first question that I've kind of put to the floor. What does competence mean to you? So we've got a little bit of time here, and it'd be interesting to hear people's thoughts, views on what competence actually is, what they feel competence to be, how they would define it, how do they define what not competent is. So it's as much about looking at the other side of the coin. We've got a bit of time to hear what your views and thoughts are before I go on to what I've discovered in some of the literature.
Adam.
Hey, mate.
No, just a comment that it was not only is it morally the right thing to do, but ethically the right thing to do as well. Yeah, it's we're beholden not to ourselves but to society to do the very best we can for nurses, and there's all those consequential issues that surround us if we don't perform competently and to our best. So that's sort of the ethical framework surrounding that. Do good or else. So the moral guides the personal stuff, you know, your personal desire to be best, your altruism and all the rest of it, to do the very best you can as a practitioner. And the ethical stuff is the surrounding background that says if you don't perform as a competent virtuous practitioner, this is what you're going to get. So stand by.
Very much so. And I think we've seen that all in the press over the years. And there's always been, I think there's been some discussion about little things. When little things don't go right, the little things can lead to bigger things that lead to bigger things that lead to bigger things. And if someone's not doing the little things right, what happens when the big things come along? So that consequential process, I think, is absolutely a consideration in that.
And the whole role modeling piece as well, it goes in with that as well. Yeah,
absolutely. And that comes to that good operator. I think, again, those people that we've seen who are good operators, and you go, she, amazing. I'd like to be like that. And I think particularly when I was a student and as I was growing in and coming out of that student into that post-registration phase, that you definitely come across those people. And even now you see people, I'm 20 odd years in, and you go, oh, I'd like to be like them. They're like amazing.
It's inspirational, isn't it?
Yeah. It is. And but it's trying to nail down what that is or what that isn't, that I think is where the challenge is.
Thanks, Hannah. I think we've got another from Celia. I think she just picked you, Mike, and I'll come to you next. So Celia, I think you had a question or an answer.
Well, yes, I'm not sure. I think it's more observations, and I'll try and be quick. I sort of tended to quite like all the rules and regulations and things there as a framework which guide you, but I'm also being a bit of a rebel. I quite like to step outside that when there's the opportunity. And I have been around as a nurse for a very long time, 45 years plus. So I've had quite a few opportunities one way or another at different times. I agree with the point that Adam made early on about how challenging it is to measure all of this. But one thing I would say, I was at the Abbey last week for the Florence Nightingale service, to my great delight. I have been before. And when I went, for whatever reason, I think I was feeling a little less optimistic and positive about nursing than I usually do. But I have to say, attending that service, talking to fellow nurses beside me, also students who I had met online but came and sought me out, I was actually inspired by the whole thing. And then to have John Sentamu, who I admire greatly, preach was a further encouragement. So I left the service, I left the Abbey really with my whole mood completely changed by what I'd experienced, and I felt very positive about nursing again. You can't measure that. I mean, I've given you a few examples of the things that made me feel better about it all, but impossible to measure.
So measure it. I completely agree. The measurability of some of these bits is incredibly challenging, and I've got a few slides a little bit later on that I'll cover some of that off with, and the challenges particularly around the non-practical, the non-technical elements to it. But yeah, I absolutely agree. Measuring it is an incredible challenge, and I think you sometimes get a feeling for what is and what isn't good. But again, it brings us back to that whole point of how do we define this? How do we put our fingers on it so that we can go, actually, not only is that good, but it's measurably good.
Thanks, Celia, and great response, Adam. I think we all felt that those that were lucky enough to be at the ceremony, it was absolutely fantastic. But I encourage you all to come next year. Anyway, sorry, just moving back to Adam's presentation. I think we've got Mike next for the question.
Yeah, thanks, Lucy.
Comment.
Adam, great start, by the way, mate. Thoroughly enjoyed that. I wonder if there's an interesting delta exists in the way we assess competence between what we perceive as competence and what in actuality is competent. And at a perception level, I would question, does that align with our identity? Because of course our professional identity is defined as the knowledge, the skills, the attitudes, the values and beliefs that align with those in our professional group. Would we perceive somebody as confident if they had the same knowledge, skills, attitudes, values and beliefs as ourselves? However, does that mean they are competent in so much as have they been assessed by a rigorously underpinning taxonomy that demonstrates competence? I just wonder if there's a delta existing there.
Well, interesting. There has been a piece of research done, and the author has gone right up. But I've seen one of the slides a little bit later on, where there is actually a divergence in expectations. So, particularly in our junior nursing cohort. So you've mentioned sort of 4 or 5 key phrases there, key sort of identifiers for competence. And sometimes there's a divergence between those who are being assessed and those who are doing the assessing. So one person's values, behaviours, attitudes, etc., may be slightly different to the others. And that works 2 ways. It's not just a case of the assessor and the assessee. Sometimes because they don't match, there is a difficulty in assigning whether that person is competent or not. And that happens particularly with really senior nurses and really junior nurses and student nurses. And we have to remember, I use myself as an example. I trained 25 years ago. Don't tell anyone, I've got a reputation. I trained 25 years ago, where my values are were very different then, in lots of respects to where they are now. So my age and experience have an impact on how I see what is right, what is wrong, what is competent, what is not. So when I see that really good operator, I'm potentially looking at someone who is more experienced than I am. But when the juniors see a good operator, they might see someone who's in my situation as experienced and go, well, he's got really good experience, he's doing this, he's doing really well. And so I think absolutely, Mike, you've hit the nail on the head. Our perceptions of what competence is are to a certain degree shaped by our identity, by a certain degree shaped by our experiences, but also our perceptions and what it is we're doing. And the other thing to remember is that and to quote Benner, can't believe that, quoting Benner 84, is that we're not all always highly competent in everything at any one time. So Benner's view was very much that you could be really experienced and really competent at this end of the spectrum, dealing with your day in, day out. So if I, as an acute medical nurse, and then someone throws a trauma patient at me, and it's like, whoa, that's got broken bones. I don't deal with broken bones. I deal with broken kidneys and broken hearts, for want of a better phrase. So competence is definitely contextual as well. And I think that Mike's points are absolutely spot on. I think that that's how it's going to help us to kind of develop some form of framework that's contextual based.
Yeah, what's really interesting there, Adam, is what you just described in many respects is social learning theory. And actually, the implicit there is how actually we could bring bias into the system as to how we assess competence in people based on whether or not they look, act, and sound like ourselves, whether their experience is the same as ourselves, whether they mirror ourselves. And actually, the implicit there is also bias. So no.
Well, there's another factor to that with us in particular as military nurses, because we see the military attract a certain type of person, and that, there's fairly strong evidence for that. And how we see our values and our standards may differ from some of our civilian counterparts as well. And that's where you've got the personal piece and you've got the professional piece and how that all ties together. So all of this, when you start to wrap it together, shows just how difficult trying to nail down a competence definition actually is. And did I just see Al Brockie there saying about a document? That's a grenade we'll keep for later, I think.
Good question for later on. I think Claire's keen. Claire's put something in the box and also raised her hand as well. So I don't know if Claire wanted to add any comments there.
Hi, yeah, I think the point is we're saying what makes a good operator, and I think the word for that is context. Like Adam has said, you can be a really good operator as a band 5 in ITU. My background's ITU, where all the bells and whistles, you're clinically competent. But then you've got your band 7, your band 8 in ITU, who might not be as I would argue clinically competent, because they're not on the shop floor, they're not delivering that band 5 care. However, they've got the experience to know how to run that unit, how to troubleshoot, how to predict. So both are very good operators, but in different ways. And as I say, to bring the donk into it, sorry to swear in front of my military colleagues, but there is no one size fits all. And the donk will never be fit for purpose because there are so many of us. Now, I think what they've done at the moment is a really, really good shot at making it work, because they've recognised that the current competency for the IPC nurse does not need to be the same as the ITU nurse, does not need to be the same as the general nurse, does not need to be the same as the governance lead. And I think whenever we talk about operators, I think we need to look at what band they're working at, what is expected of them, and what they deliver, because that is going to be different across the different specialties, across the banding streams, and what we're actually expecting from these people. So I think context is the key word for this. And I'll shut up now.
No, I absolutely agree with you. And this is where some of my work piece is coming in that what I'm aiming to look at is not so much the technical bits that go with a specific area, such as medicine, IPC, governance, etc., is to look at some of the non-technical elements. How do we identify those? So obviously there's, I'm conscious of time, there's a slide further on in my slide set, there's some information about some work that's already been done by the Royal College of Surgeons, for example, on their non-technical competence. So I think that the DONC, again, swearing, still needs a lot of work, and we still need to do some work, a lot of work on how we use that contextually to assure our people as they get ready to deploy, which leads us quite nicely onto the next slide. So if we can go on to the next slide, thank you so much everyone for your input on that at the moment. There is another question a little bit further on, so I'll whiz through these because it's great to get conversation with lots of people. So Mike in particular raised a few words. There's a word cloud there, which takes into account 11, I think, key words that I'd found in the literature relating specifically to competence. So there's behaviour, experience, skills, concept, statutory, situation, so judgment, acquisition. There's all of those together kind of give a very woolly view of what competence actually is. And it's nice that some of the key points, I've made some notes here, some of the key points in that discussion piece kind of reverberate with those. But interestingly, there was a few in the discussion piece, few words that weren't drawn out from the literature. So that gives some real food for thought on, is the literature hitting where we need it to be? Because obviously we all want it to be research based. So how can we move that on? And that's something that we'll deal with over the next next 18 months for me as I do my doctorate. Next slide, please. So you can see even from that short discussion that we've just had, competence means different things to different people. And situational context. And someone can be incredibly competent in one thing, but perhaps not so strong or not so competent in another. And we kind of have to take that into account when we're looking at that. Within nursing, we deliver on so many fronts at to so many different people with so many different things that how do we become competent? And that's a real challenge for us because we've got that such a diverse remit to work in that developing this has become a real problem. And as I said earlier, a lot of the competence literature, and Fakada's work in 2018, he did a literature review that went all the way back to 1981. A lot of it focuses on pre-registration and the first 5 years. We still have to remain competent beyond that 5-year point. And how do we do that? Now, if you're deemed competent at the 5-year point, is that it? Do we move on? Who knows? Next slide, please. So from an academic perspective, looking at what the literature says and picking up on some of the points that have already been made, obscure definitions are very common. If you look through some of the definitions that I've found, they differ from person to person, and even a subtle couple of words difference actually makes quite a significant difference to the meaning of that sentence. So that creates a challenge in itself. Measurement is difficult to define, is frequently unsystematic, and we've already mentioned one tool already. The reliability and validity of that tool is often really quite unreported. So we need to look at, does it measure what we want it to measure, and does it do that on a repeated basis? Cassidy's work again goes to multiple interpretations, and then you've got Levine and Johnson in ambiguity, highlighting ambiguity and what competent actually means. And importantly, they add on how to remain competent. So it's not just gaining the competence, but it's remaining competent beyond that initial piece. Next slide, please. One thing that has confused, and it's quite interesting piece to pick up on, is the difference between competence and competency. I see it as one thing. My kind of personal view is that competence is the whole package. Competency are like the constituent parts of that competence. It's compliant with care standards, and competence has wider implications involving education and experience. And we've already had an example of an intensive care nurse and nurse with someone who's clinically very competent at the bedside, and people who are experienced, but away from that, are they incompetent, or have they lost their competence, or do they need to refresh on that competency to become competent again? So the interchangeable use of these terms, both in the literature and in practice, creates real difficulty. So if I say to a student nurse, you need to complete those competencies, they go, great, I've completed my competencies, I'm competent. The question is, are you, or is it you're just competent in that area? And that's what creates, adds to the challenge that we've got. Next slide, please. So there are lots of different ways, and I'm going to whistle through these. I'm conscious of time. So there's performance competence, which is very much driven by skills. I've mentioned the donk word in there, don't tell anyone, but it's very much a skills-based assessment. And a lot of what we deliver now, certainly in the clinical space, revolves around the ability to competently perform a skill. So can you take blood? Can you cannulate? Can you put a tube in? Can you take a tube out? Can you do it safely and competently? Gonchi's work, I know it's a little bit dated, but actually creates a really good issue in that it creates a very, very narrow view of what competence actually is. There's more to it than that. Next slide, please. Building on one of, or some of what Mike mentioned earlier, behaviours and attributes are a kind of key part of competence as well. The problem with those is they can be difficult to transfer. They're very individualised. They're covered off in the NMC competence document as well. So how do we measure behaviour and attitude? How do we create a process by which we can see that person as being competent by delivery of their attitudes, by their behavioural piece? And the issue that's been raised in some of the literature is that it's all very dependent on situations, and training for situations is incredibly difficult. We see lots of simulated learning now. I know there's lots of pieces being done within the military about simulated learning. We see advanced life support as another example. It's a course that's based on a simulation, but it's very much about that situation at that time. And if you've performed competently at that point, will that then transfer to the real life situation? Also, you've got to bear in mind pattern recognition, which is a key part of behaviour and attitude, is very much experience dependent. So my high level pattern recognition will be very different to a very junior colleague, and maybe quite different to someone who's a bit more senior. But again, context driven. Next slide, please. So we come on to the concept of holism, and holism underpins an awful lot of what our competence definitions currently are. There are seven characteristics that Church identified there. So understand discipline, mastery of specific skills, sound professional judgment, respect for and adherence standards, etc., etc. And these are common. Now, if you look at the NMC, I refer back to that because that's obviously our regulatory body. You can compare some of these seven characteristics to some of the four characteristics that they identify. The problem with the NMC is that the measurable piece isn't there. It's a wonderful document. It's a 21-page document. These are this, and this is what we expect. But there's no measurability on it. And there's not much by way of guidance on how you then go about applying that. So they've kind of addressed the issue of competence, but haven't really gone into the weeds of how we can then deliver that. Next slide, please. So as I've mentioned, they're the NMC. So they cover professional values, communication, nursing practice, and leadership. Interestingly, at the back end, or almost at the bottom end of that document, there's a small handful of clinical skills, 5 clinical skills, of which medicines management, diet, fluids, etc., are covered off. What interested me was there was no identification and management of the deteriorating patients. So as an acute care nurse, it was very much, okay, that's a little bit odd, but we are here to critique and look and evaluate those. Interestingly, a lot of these are built into the NHS knowledge and skills framework, and if you look at the NHS job descriptions, you'll get a 20-page document that says you need to do this. But again, measurability is a real challenge for that. Within the military context, we don't have, our job descriptions are absolutely the other end of the spectrum. We'll get a 2-pager before we deploy, and half of that is the title and all the quals that come with it. So we've got absolutely the other end of the spectrum, and this is where some of this work has kind of come from. Next slide, please. So just to give a little bit of military context and where I'm coming from a competence perspective, we work as military personnel, we work in a very changeable and different environment. Working in, and I'm going to point up to the Queen Elizabeth, which is about 500 meters that way, is very different to working in a war zone, in a humanitarian situation. I've deployed into Afghanistan on a warfighting footing, but I've also deployed to Sierra Leone to help deal with the Ebola outbreak. 2 incredibly different operations with incredibly different focus, and how we prepared ourselves for that. Well, we didn't really have much time for the latter one. It was literally, here you go, you've got 5 days, you're off. And that was a challenge in itself because we didn't know what we were going to be facing. So the military challenge is that not only do we have to meet UK statutory requirements, we also have to meet military requirements. So can I defend myself if it really goes bad, or can I defend my patient? Can I cannulate this patient, or so on and so forth? So a real challenge. Next slide, please. So what the research is currently showing at the moment is that deployed work and experience doesn't match our clinical exposure within the UK. That was a piece done by Finnegan, and military nurses really do feel underprepared for their deployment. So they could be this good operator in the NHS, and then we take them out of the NHS, which is where they do all their practice. We plop them into somewhere else, which is completely different, and the tables really do turn. And I've seen that happen on a number of occasions in some of our training settings. Mars work in 19 identified 3 key differences: uncertain physical environment, complex psychological challenge in that we just didn't know what we were going to see next, and a different professional environment and scope of practice. And that's the NHS versus the military piece. So clinical competence may not necessarily relate very well to what we require on deployment and the deployment competence. And next slide, please. So the challenge for us really is that we have to start to think about how we're going to match our skills with the population, the environment and the mission, plus our wider military roles. How do we marry them together? And how do we marry them so that we can utilize them very, very quickly? As a result of all of this, Griffiths and Jasper in 2007 wrote about the duality that a lot of nurses feel, the conflict between being a carer inside a fighting force. And that is something that military nurses do have to reconcile. What I found on my systematic review is that there is very, very limited research on what nurse competence is, particularly for military nurses. That has created a nice little hole in the market, nice little niche in the market for me to exploit in terms of doctoral studies. Next slide, please. So that brings us quite nicely onto the next question point. I am conscious of time. And at the asking the questions, what do people think of, or what do people understand by the term non-technical competence? So we'll park the ability to cannulate, take blood, put tubes in, take tubes out, the practical skills to one side for a moment, what do people feel are those non-technical competencies that we need to function? I think Lucy's screen has frozen. It's either that or it's me.
I think it comes down to virtues again while you're talking. But
Yes,
then I'm an ethics man, you know that. It comes down to virtues for me, the non-technical stuff. I like Aristotle, a bit of an Aristotelian swap. And he says you've got emotional virtues and intellectual virtues, and that they govern your ultimate competence, which is navigating the golden mean through all of these virtues, to prevent you from having an excess or deficiency of any of those particular virtues, which might sort of stray you off the golden mean. And if you follow the golden mean long enough and you accrue enough experience throughout your life, you'll eventually reach what they call eudaimonia, which is the state of ultimate human flourishing, and you become the ultimate wise practitioner or wise person or wise whatever profession you choose to work in. And it's all about accrual of experience through life. It's about exposing yourself to sets of circumstances and basically learning from your mistakes as you go along. And it's the insight and intelligence to be able to learn from your mistakes and to govern your way through these intellectual and sort of moral virtues that is what ultimately leads to your sort of your point as a role model and good competence and a good competent operator.
Yeah, and it's interesting that the experience thing is certainly something that's come out of my investigations on these so far, that the more experienced you are, the more able you are to reconcile those into almost traits. So from my experience, I've been here before, I can lead this, I've done it before, or I can communicate that really well. So it's
assimilation and having the intelligence and insight to be able to use that wisely. See, it's all virtue ethics, mate. That's what it is.
Taking over the world, mate.
Okay, sorry, apologies for that. I think I froze momentarily. Apologies. So we've got another question or comment from Claire on the competencies. Hi, Claire.
Hi, thanks, Lucy. I think I've put it in the chat box as well, but I think essentially it's about the way we do business. You know, you can have a really good outcome and be really competent about it, but if you've trodden on everybody and their grandma to get to that output, I would suggest that doesn't make you a very good operator. And I think, you know, self-awareness comes into it, knowing your limitations, all of what we call soft skills, which actually I don't think are soft at all. I think they're vital. And I think sometimes when we talk about competence, we do focus far too much on the outcome rather than how we got there, how we treated people within our team, what we learnt on the way, and role modeling comes into this. And I think when we look at our role models, whether it's in the clinical space or the non-clinical space, it's people are normally saying, you know, I want to be like that person because of the way they do something, not, you know, necessarily their outputs, but it's the way they carry themselves, the way they treat people, the way they communicate. And I think that's at the core of making someone, certainly in my own personal opinion, of what makes a good operator. It's not necessarily the output, it's the way that they do things.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It's interesting you mentioned soft skills. I mentioned the term soft skills to one of my surgical colleagues, to which his response is, they're not soft skills, they're vital skills, which is absolutely right. And his view on it, and he was involved in the Royal College of Surgeons piece, and that ongoing work. And their view is very much it's as these skills, these non-technical skills, are just as important as the ability to deliver your practical skill as well. And like I said, if you've got a team in front of you and you've delivered the result, but you've trodden all over them to get to that result, that's not going to bode well for your future working, is it? So, no, absolutely agree.
Well said. Really good points made. Have we got time for one more question, Adam? Is that? We've got Angus has had his hand up for a while.
Yeah, please do.
Or
Please do.
comment. Angus, I've done we missed you out last time, so conscious. So over to you, Angus.
That's okay. So yeah, if we're looking at sort of non-technical issues, and I confess I've listed these from elsewhere. So intelligence, conscientiousness, openness to experience, emotional stability, and self-efficacy, i.e., self-belief to do the role you're doing, would all be skills that would create competence. They're not really measurable. And they have nothing to do with other people's perceptions of your competence, but they basically they feed into an ability to be competent in a role. Yeah, I think that's all I've got to say.
Thanks, Angus.
Cheers, Angus. No, again, it's trying to nail these down, because ultimately, if we're going to look at something that's going to go along the lines of helping us assure our people before they go, or prepare our people before they go, then we're going to need to understand, for us contextually, what's important. You know, the military themselves are world leaders on leadership, for example. People come from around the world to either go to Sandhurst, the Defence Academy, to do the higher level leadership. But there's very little that relates to the clinical setting. So even if we go and do our staff training, it has nothing to do with what we deliver when we're on clinical ops, but rather how we then communicate with the wider military world. So absolutely, I think what we need to do, and this is kind of the purpose of this starting work, is to identify what do we as military nurses need to do non-technically in order to be deemed as competent, and how can we measure that, and how can we train that. So first step is the what as opposed to the how, and that's kind of where my work is kind of going. But again, what I'll do is I'll just quickly, again, conscious of time, I'll quickly run through these last few slides, and hopefully that will give you a little bit of context, and then we can have some any final questions. So non-technical competence, very much about the recognition that not everything is based around the practical ability. We can have someone who, and it was mentioned earlier with the ITU scenario, who may not be so competent at cannulating a patient because they haven't done it for a while, but they are superb at leading the situation where that patient has become particularly unwell. And that's where you use the delegation piece or the communication piece to look after that team as well. That said, there's very, very limited granular information about what about the non-technical contribution to competence. Very few people have really gone into it, and you see occasionally communication, but you won't see that wrapped in the bigger piece. The knowledge and skills framework, as I alluded to earlier, do have some non-technical skills, but again, how that's then applied to our nursing is a little bit woolly, and within the military we really don't have anything specific on that, despite the fact that, as I've said already, we are world leaders on leadership, for example, and communication in certain situations. Next slide, please. So I'm just a very brief introduction. I'll make sure that the reference for this goes out. Royal College of Surgeons developed their non-technical skills for surgeons, NOTS. The last update was 2019, it was version 1.2, and it has very specific non-technical skills that are measured. It's used to help train their junior surgeons, and it's formative rather than a summative. It's kind of a guide more than anything else on how to move people on. So next slide, please. And that, just as you can see on there, when this goes out, you'll be able to have a look at those skills individually. There is a little bit on assessment, but not a great amount, and there's no real granular detail on how you can then deliver that. So it's a starting point, and it's certainly something that we can look to our surgical colleagues potentially and say, oh, I like those. How are we going to use them? How do we develop them? How do we refine them? And how is that going to affect my practice as well as the practice of those around me? Next slide, please. As I've mentioned there, it is a limited piece. It's very limited to the intraoperative phrase, and they use, as a quote, scrubbed and gloved from that part of their surgery. Next slide, please. So last couple of slides, just to cover off some of the challenges. The divergent definitions and assessments between stakeholders. If I work in one trust and I then go to another trust, to another trust, to another trust, and we find this as military nursing, quite often we're asked to, we need to reassess you on that skill. And the way that it's done might be slightly different. It might be a different cannula. It might be a different needle. It might be a different tube. And that creates inconsistency across all of those organizations. And then when our military nurses come to us, we'll use something completely different as well. So there's an inconsistent approach between the stakeholders. There's lack of standardized approach between employers, so the military and the NHS. And we found this, that we can have extremely experienced military nurses who have been in all kinds of situations, but because of the way that contracts work, they end up limited in what they can offer within the clinical space, certainly within the NHS clinical space. And our posting cycles don't help that. So once you've established yourself as actually you are a good operator, we then move you and you've got to reassert yourself as a good operator in a completely different environment. And that's a real challenge for our people as well. The reliability and validity, as I've mentioned earlier, we just don't have that captured very well. And like I've mentioned also, the interpretations between assessors and the assessed can be quite different too. Next slide, please. The NMC doesn't help. They've got a document, and dare I say it in this forum, that the NMC aren't always helpful. There's no specific definition of competence within their framework. They just provide some of the attributes and a very woolly approach to how we then assess that. And it does refer heavily back to pre-registration training, which again creates a real challenge for us who are a little bit further down the line. How do we deem ourselves competent, and how do we then maintain that? It's highly focused on clinical skills and working. All of this is highly focused on clinical skills within the NHS and the military. And again, that challenges us to think about what are our non-technical elements. Next slide, please. So I've mentioned very briefly human factors. Human factors, the non-technical competence, and I just want to differentiate the two. Non-technical competence is not about human factors. Human factors is about the behaviour of groups and behaviour within the safety set. This is non-technical competence, certainly from my perspective, is very much about the individual and how those individuals are deemed to be competent within those non-technical skills. There's a very strong association, but I do quite frequently get asked, this is all about human factors then. And it's like, actually, no, we're looking at the individual in themselves. Next slide, please. So my final slide, barring the final thought, is firstly that there is very little specifically relating to nursing non-technical competence. It's very little relating to any non-technical competence. Which means we can argue that a large part of the nursing role is not fully understood. We kind of know what is good, we know what is bad, but how do we teach and measure that? Most competence work relates to practical skills, because actually that's almost an easy bit. You either put the cannula in right or you don't. And that because it's that much easier to focus on that, I think we've shied away from the non-technical elements. It's a challenge to both NHS and military. This is not unique to us as military nurses. It's not unique to the NHS environment. I think it's any nursing within any environment. We've just put a slight perspective on it because that's the area that we're coming from. But I think there's lessons to be learned in both areas. More work is definitely required to understand this, and the evidence or lack thereof definitely supports that. So niche in the market, which I fully intend to exploit. And the next stage on from identifying what those non-technical skills are is how do we then assure them? How do we teach them? How do we make sure that our people are, whether it's NHS or military, are competent and able to deliver that, deliver what we need them to do for the environment that they're delivering in. Like I said, it's very easy for us to go, they're really good, they're amazing, but we need to put our finger on it. We need to understand that so that we can help grow, nurture and develop those who are coming in behind. So my final slide, next slide please, is to leave you with that final thought of what is a good operator? We kind of see it, we kind of know it, we kind of understand it, but how do we define it? What is it? And that concludes my piece. Bit of a whistle-stop tour, I'm afraid. But thank you for everyone for engaging. It was lovely. Thank you.
Thank you. So are you happy to take about 5 minutes for questions or comments?
Yeah,
I think
absolutely.
you've given a lot of food for thought. My brain is whirring with lots of ideas, but I won't take the floor. But I think Mike's had his hand up for quite some time, and then we'll go to there's been lots of comments in the chat box as well. So Mike, over to you first.
Lucy, thank you. Adam, really interesting what you were saying there about non-technical skills or non-technical competence. And I appreciate that we can define non-technical skills as those skills that aren't required specifically for that specific role. But actually, where do you sit on the school of thought that there is no such thing as a non-technical skill? Because to suggest that the skill is non-technical can also fall into the nurture and nature debate, suggesting a non-technical skill cannot be taught. Well, actually, there is a school of thought that suggests you can teach people to communicate and to fulfill those other four elements. And actually, to communicate is a vital part of putting the cannula in, which actually, therefore, may, and I'm playing devil's advocate slightly here, suggest that there's no such thing as a non-technical skill because all skills are technical. Where do you stand on that?
But there is, you're absolutely right. There are innate. Now, I'll use myself as an example. I'll talk the legs off an iron pot. You stand still for long enough and I'll chat to you. Whether you're a patient or whether you're a colleague or whatever, I'll just keep jabbering away. So that having that initial ability to communicate gives me that starting point. But I also appreciate there are other people who may not be quite so willing to talk, and that's where you can help support and grow and nurture. I think for the purposes of, and this is the defining piece, it's the semantic piece. For the purposes of this work, the non-technical elements are defined as non-practical skills. I'm looking at the big wide world of communication, leadership, teamwork, that kind of, and you can teach some of that, which if you can teach it, is it technical? But we also, so if you think about us when we go through Army Officer selection, it's multi-layered, isn't it? It's not just one thing, it's lots of things all happening at the same time. And that's what creates the challenge for identifying and assessing and measuring and assuring, because it's not just one instant. Now I can tell, we can teach someone to introduce themselves and then hi, my name's Adam, I need to pop a line in, are you happy with that, and so on and so forth. So we can give people the spiel on that. How they deliver that may differ from patient to patient, situation to situation, and what else is going on in their worlds as well. So there's for the purposes of this work, non-technical skills are those that are non-practically orientated, i.e. the physical skills of cannulating or taking a tube out or so on and so forth.
Thanks, Adam. I think what moves on really nicely to Celia's comment in the box is actually we're talking about non-technical and soft skills, but actually are these the skills that we need as nurses, midwives to contribute to the patient feeling safe, assured, comfortable? What are your thoughts on that?
No, I think these skills all kind of go into that, and this is what makes it so difficult to understand, but and to grow a means of assurance and assessment, because just by virtue of looking at well, I think it's Cecilia, wasn't it? Well, she's her perspective, and then Mike's perspective and somebody else's perspective. That's where the challenge actually exists. So how do we even identify those skills to start with? We all say communicate.
Awareness, yeah.
You say to someone, non-technical, and one of the first things that comes out is communication. Well, what do you mean by communication? And then how do I, and if you're in communication, so you've got an emergency situation, communication may be, right, I need you to do this, you to do this, you to do this. But on another day, communication might be, unfortunately, I've got some bad news, or we need to sit down and have a chat. So it's nailing down that context, and someone's just put complaint data. It's looking at that information that's there around surrounding those to really understand what it means. And a lot of complaints, it's interesting, the complaint one, a lot of complaints in my experience as a nurse manager are not around the practical skills. They're not around this, that, the other. They're around, how did you speak to my relative? How did you speak to me in that situation? What did you do to help? And those kind of things, not the, well, you took blood. I did.
They made someone feel. Yeah, Georgie's
so
made a really good point here. She's articulating that compassion is often remembered and not the great cannula that saved your life. How you made somebody feel, isn't it? Back to Maya Angelou, isn't she? That's a really famous quote from her.
And that then, you know, how do we as nurses, how do I assure that, and how do I take that forward with teaching that kind of thing? And when we deploy a military team out the door, what is it we're looking for? Are we looking for that element, that side of communication, or are we looking for that, right, it's hit the fan, we need to get on and do this? So is it a bit of both?
Different contexts, different environments.
That's why this piece of work is about this.
Right. Adam, we're sadly out of time, which is such a shame, because I'm really enjoying the debate and I've got loads of things I want to contribute. We would love it if you'd come back and perhaps report back on how your thesis is progressing.
Absolutely.
Time. So perhaps we have a part 2 to feedback. I think it'd be really wonderful. So yeah, everyone's nodding, so that's good. It's really good to see how you progress and how you have measured this. So sorry everyone, we've had to finish today, but thank you so much for joining us. The recorded version will be available in a couple of days. Once we've had a chance to edit, it'll be on our YouTube channel. So do share with colleagues who will find it useful. Adam, absolutely an absolute pleasure to have you today, and I'm glad you've agreed to come back. We'll look forward to that. Please do get in contact with us if there's any speakers you would like to hear from, any topics you would like covered. We're absolutely thrilled to announce that we're going to be launching our global webinar series, which will be in a couple of weeks' time with THET, looking at supporting internationally recruited nurses and midwives. So please do join us for that. We've got lots of exciting webinars coming up. I think we're booked out till August. So anyone to hear from, let us know about. Thank you for joining us, and have a wonderful afternoon all. Take care.